Good evening. I'm so glad to be with everybody tonight and so happy to see so many people turning out for this wonderful and interesting event. As we all know, I've done so much reporting on this and know firsthand a lot about this, but the numbers are frightening and staggering when it comes to addiction in this country. There are more than 23.5 million addicts in the United States. The costs are staggering. The substance abuse costs $600 billion every single year. But the cutting-edge scientists here on this stage tonight in just a few minutes are doing incredible work and will be joining me on the stage and to talk about that, finding out about how the brains of drug addicts, alcoholics, smokers, and perhaps even people who are obese may be different, have special different characteristics. We're also going to talk about whether or not you can tell an addict's brain before they begin abusing a substance, and whether or not the damage that addicts do to their brains can be reversed. So they are learning that there is a physical change in brain also from adolescence to adulthood, and this, of course, may explain why so many young people tend to get addicted in their teenage years. There are also vaccines on the horizon, if you can believe this, that might be able to block the effect of addictive drugs and therefore may combat addiction in this country. There is, of course, so much urgency in their work and their study, and it's not just because of the numbers of addicts and not just because the cost of addiction in this country every single year, but most importantly, the impact of addiction and addicts and what it has on their lives and the lives of their loved ones.
My name is Seth Manukin. I'm 42 years old. I attended Harvard University, and I currently am the Associate Director of MIT's graduate program in science writing. I've written 3 books. My most recent book, The Panic Virus, about vaccines and autism, won the National Association of Science Writers Science and Society Book Award. I'm very luckily and happily married with 2 children, and for the better part of 10 years, I was a drug addict. I started experiencing fairly severe anxiety around when I was 7 years old. I became obsessed with my walking and obsessed with my breathing, and eventually by the time I was 8 or 9, I began to have a lot of trouble sleeping. I never sought out drugs consciously because of anxiety. I thought of myself as someone who was countercultural to the extent that a white middle-class child living in Newton, Massachusetts could be countercultural, but was also aware from very early on that I was not using drugs in a way that was conducive to having a good time. I was sharing needles with people who I knew were not safe. I went through a couple of phases of pretty severe crack use. On one particular occasion, I became convinced that I had somehow spilled some crack on the floor of the kitchen of the rental apartment where I was living, and so I ended up essentially like digging up linoleum to see if there was crack residue on it. My family had not completely cut off contact with me, but were very close to that. They had changed the locks on the house. They started to check in with each other on a daily basis to see if something had happened to me. There were so many points in that period of my life when I was addicted where, literally one tick of the clock, 1 second difference, and I wouldn't be here. When Philip Seymour Hoffman died, it did really affect me. He had been sober for over 20 years, and then he picked up, and now he's dead. And just the speed with which that happened, it made me realize the vigilance that I need to have to never forget the fact that I spent the better part of a decade as a drug addict. feel very lucky that I made it through. There were a lot of people that I used with that didn't. The biggest misconception about addiction is the sense that it's a willpower issue. We have come a long way towards recognizing that addiction is a disease, but we still have a long way to go.
We'll be talking a lot more about that willpower debate because, as Seth just pointed out, even though for decades the AMA has classified addiction as alcoholism, for example, as a disease, so many people in society now still view this as you aren't strong enough, you aren't committed enough, you just don't have enough willpower to stop. And the science and the scientists you're about to meet will tell you that in many cases it is not about willpower at all. It is about something much more fundamentally scientific. So let's meet our panel. As a research psychiatrist and scientist, our first participant pioneered the use of brain imaging to investigate the toxic effects and addictive properties of abusable drugs. Her studies have documented changes in the dopamine system affecting, among others, the functions of frontal brain regions involved with motivation, drive, and pleasure. As the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse for the past 11 years, she, perhaps more than any individual, is guiding us on how we research drug abuse and addiction. Please welcome Dr. Nora Volkow.
Hello.
Our next participant is the chair of the Neuroscience Department and director of the Friedman Brain Institute at Mount Sinai University Medical Center. His research aims to better understand the molecular mechanisms of addiction. He is a leader in the study of how drug addiction impacts gene expression. Please welcome Dr. Eric Nestler. Our next participant is the Eli Callaway Jr. Chaired Professor at the Scripps Research Institute. He developed a vaccine that blocked the effects of heroin addiction and hopes to extend the research to other drugs, such as nicotine and alcohol, as well as other drugs. Please welcome Dr. Kim Janda. And our final participant is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist at Columbia University and authored research on nicotine being a gateway drug to cocaine with Eric and Denise Kandel. He also is working currently on how the adolescent brain looks different than the adult brain and how that can make them more susceptible to addiction, the adolescents. Please welcome Dr. Amir Levine. And before we start, I just want to encourage you, feel free to jump in. If somebody says something that's interesting that you can elaborate on, this isn't assigned answers only. But I do want to start with you, Dr. Volkow. Before we start to examine how the addicted brain actually looks, can you just give us a broad sense of the state of addiction, the play of addiction, the politics of addiction in this country?
That's a complex question. I can say what we know from science, we've come to recognize that repeated drug use changes the brain in long-lasting ways. And that has led to the concept not just that addiction is a disease of the brain, but that it is a chronic disease, which is very relevant for treatment because it means that you require continued treatment. And in that respect, it's not different from cancer, which for most of the cancers, we cannot cure, but we can treat. Mm-hmm. And so is the situation with drug addiction. Unfortunately, even though the science has shown that it's a disease of the brain, it has been very difficult to incorporate into the healthcare system. And as a result of that, many cases of drug addiction are never recognized or prevented or treated. And so when you're speaking to me about the question on the politics, I think that there's a lot to do yet in order to be able to bring addiction into the healthcare system and also to change the attitudes because addiction is still highly, highly stigmatized. And as a result of that, people that are addicted themselves are afraid to ask for help, and the families don't speak about it because they don't want to be stigmatized. And now that healthcare reform is coming up, for the first time we're going to have the opportunity of getting insurance to people that are addicted to drugs. But otherwise, it's basically the resources have not been there to help address the problem.
You were talking about the long-term damage that drug abuse does to the brain. You just heard Seth Mnookin in that video talk about Philip Seymour Hoffman, 23 years sober, reportedly picked up a drink at a wrap party for a movie. One cocktail is what led him down that slippery slope back to heroin, and that's how he died.
Yeah, no, and it's a very unfortunate, but really does epitomize that knowledge that we have that the changes are very long-lasting and persist months or years after the person has stopped taking the drug, which is why I come back to the sense we need to recognize that it's a chronic disease, and that people that have suffered from it have to be cautious and sustain some level of treatment in order to prevent them from relapse. And we see, I mean, that is a very tragic story, but unfortunately, it's not as unique. And you see it, people that have been able to stay drug-free for 10 years, then something stressful happens and they relapse. And they escalate immediately to the same levels that they were taking before 10 years prior. So this is what characterizes the process of drug addiction.
There are essentially permanent physical changes in the brain at several levels that could be seen as molecular, cellular scars of the addiction. And these can last a lifetime, so that when a person like Philip Seymour Hoffman comes across a drink for the first time or heroin for the first time, the relapse can be very rapid and severe.
But I'm just curious, and this is to all of you, the damage that you do to your brain by chronic drug abuse or by alcoholism, is any of it reversible? We always hear that, you know, some drugs permanently damage. And for example, you know, crystal meth, a completely synthetic drug. Does that do irreversible damage? Is that done? There's nothing you can do ever to fix your brain again?
I'm smiling because it's obviously something that I've been very much interested in looking at, and depends when you would have asked me that question, but there's been tremendous, tremendous advances in our understanding about how the brain actually repairs itself. A lot of it driven by work done on the recovery of the brain when someone suffers a stroke. And now the rehabilitation,
TBI, traumatic brain injury.
Exactly, the rehabilitation process allows for them to recover significantly function, and we're making advances to try to accelerate that process. So I would say that there, as of now, there is significant recovery, but it's also variable. Some people recover faster than others, depends on your age, depends how many drugs that you have had, but it also depends on your genetics. But I also see it as very optimistic, and I'm not one of those fluffy optimists, but actually based on what we know of the science, where it's going, that in the future we will be able to accelerate that process of recovery. But that's my perspective. I mean, my colleagues here...
No, I agree.
That it is possible. Can you elaborate?
Dr. Volkow gives me a lot of grant money, so I can't disagree with her.
No, Eric, come on.
No, I agree. I think the brain has enormous reparative processes. And a lot of the things that drugs do to damage the brain are probably reversible. Probably the aspect that persists...
Over what amount of time?
Well, I think it varies from person to person and type of change to type of change. But one of the things that lasts the longest are the memories associated with drug use and the conditioning, the learning that occurs. As Nora mentioned, a person could come across a stressful experience, be abstinent for years, a bit of stress, basically dark periods that every person has at different points in their lives, come about, and those memories of how to deal with the stress come up as the easiest thing to do is to go back to drug to make you feel better. I don't know if you agree.
It's not just that that's your sort of go-to knee-jerk reaction. I've also heard that the actual memories that you form while abusing alcohol, abusing drugs, are more vivid, more powerful in a sense. Is that the case?
Yes.
I think you have to look at the brain as it's dynamic. It's not static. It's constantly being remodeled, whether you're taking a drug or not taking a drug. And you know, that's the difficulty of treating these diseases caused by this, is because there's so many processes that if you block maybe one receptor, it can go down another pathway.
Mm-hmm. But you know, one of the things that is, to your question of memory, why it's exactly on target, We remember things that are emotionally ridden, right? So when the Twin Towers came down, each one of us remembers what they were doing. And this is because it was horrific, it was unexpected. And when events that are unexpected and salient occur, you liberate dopamine. And dopamine then stimulates at high concentrations a specific type of proteins that results in this immediate conditioning. And conditioning is a memory that will enable you when you are exposed to the same situation, not just to remember conceptually, but to feel it. Mm-hmm. And drugs, by their pure nature, drugs increase dopamine. So when you take a drug, you are by default activating this memory process that Eric was speaking about, which we call conditioning. And this conditioning will lead you to desire that drug the next time you're in the same environment. So you become conditioned. And those are the memories that actually stay with you and will drive the behavior even years after you have not seen the drug.
Is that why I've heard addicts talk about the fact, in particular one heroin addict I knew, she told me about her using dreams. Like you hear addicts in recovery talking about that a lot, the dreams that they have of either drinking or shooting up or doing whatever it was that they did that led them to get into trouble.
That's actually very common. And I'm a clinician as well as a scientist, and I actually wanted to say that there is a lot of hope. Just from my own clinical practice and experience, I've known quite a few people who were able to become sober, even from crystal meth and other drugs, and actually really resume a very productive life. But they do talk about drug dreams, and they have different attitudes to cope with those drug dreams. Some people say, okay, they wake up in the morning and they just laugh at it and they say, okay, I had a drug dream and I can move on. Or even like, okay, I got a chance to try it out without really relapsing. So they have a positive attitude, but some people are really traumatized by it, and it's really hard for them.
It's just, I've heard that they're vivid that way, and I wondered if that was related to the fact that the memory itself, the imprint on the brain has been so. All right, we've got some slides. Let's start with one of the slides that you have of a brain addicted to cocaine in this case. What are we looking at?
Well, what you're looking at there is actually, we're measuring images that reflect the concentration of a protein that we call dopamine D2 receptor. And it's a protein that is very important because it regulates the function of the cortical processes. It actually allows us to exert control. You see the control subjects, and in the center of the brain, you see high red areas, because that's where you have very high concentration of these D2 receptors. Then you see a methamphetamine abuser with much lower coloring red on the center of the brain, because the receptors are down, the dopamine D2 receptor. And then you see a control subject to the, I don't know, I actually have to look back, to your right, and you see that color, and you also see that in the alcoholic is down. And this is a very typical change that we observe across a wide variety of addictions. People that are addicted to drugs have a reduction in the expression of these proteins, the dopamine D2 receptors. And these decreases in the expression of dopamine D2 receptors in humans and in animal models, and Eric has done a lot of work here too, actually are associated with impulsive behaviors and a propensity to engage in compulsive behaviors when you are exposed to rewarding stimuli. And this is because, again, these areas in the center of the brain, which we call the striatum, and in these areas, the D2 receptors allows us to regulate the frontal cortex, the frontal areas of the brain here, which are crucial for our ability to exert self-control, whether it is controlling our emotions or our desires. But proper signaling through these D2 receptors is necessary for the function of our prefrontal cortices.
So basically, what we're looking, and I'm just curious, were these people, did these alcoholic brains and methamphetamine abuser brains look this way before they began abusing methamphetamines and alcohol?
Well, unfortunately, when you are doing these clinical studies, it's very difficult to have measures before they take drugs. And so in this case, we do not know if these decreases are due to the use of drugs or whether they were like that, and that makes them vulnerable. But we can take these findings and then bring them into an animal model in the laboratory and assess, for example, and this has been done both in rodents and in non-human primates, where you measure the D2 receptors before and after long-term exposure to the drugs. And studies have shown that indeed, when you give in non-human primates repeated administration of cocaine, you bring down the levels of dopamine D2 receptors in the brain. So we do know that repeated use of drugs will bring them down. But as for these particular subjects, we cannot be ever certain whether this is the drug. It's very likely that drugs are contributing to the reductions. That we can say.
And if these two brains, this alcoholic and this drug addict, were able to remain sober, would their brains go back to looking like the control subjects?
We've tried to look at that, and in the methamphetamine abusers, where we have been more successful, we have seen actually some recovery in some individuals, but not in others. So we see a tremendous variability on the rate of recovery of the brain when a person stops taking the drug, and we are not certain exactly what's determining the ability to recover after abstinence. One of the factors that's likely to play a very important role is your age. The younger you are, the more resilient your brain is, and the faster it recovers, but also the characteristics of the drugs that you are taking. We see the worst outcomes when we have people that take multiple drugs of abuse. That appears to be particularly harmful. For example, combination of alcohol and cocaine, methamphetamine and alcohol. Those two are very harmful. And it is very likely that obviously genetics play a role.
We're going to get to genetics in a moment, but you also had one more slide you wanted to show us, because you've studied obesity and think that actually addiction to food may be very similar to it. I mean, a lot of people don't view that. We have a hard enough time getting people to accept the fact that addiction to alcohol or addiction to methamphetamine is a sickness. Addiction to food is something else.
Well, it's interesting because the reason why we started to work with obesity was we were showing systematically these reductions in dopamine D2 receptor across a wide variety of types of addiction. And there's a certain similarity in the phenotypic expression that you see in obesity of compulsive food consumption, despite the fact that people don't want to eat anymore and despite its very adverse consequences. So at that time, I was very interested to see if one would observe the same changes in D2 receptors in a presentation that behaviorally is very similar, but did not require the administration of a chemical artificial substance. And that's how we ended up studying obesity. And lo and behold, we identified these changes that you see there, that in obese individuals, by the way, these are morbidly obese individuals, they did have also, like we had seen in people that were addicted to drugs, a reduction in their levels of dopamine D2 receptors in their brains.
Okay. Let's turn very quickly to Dr. Nestler. I wanted to pick up this whole dopamine issue with you because you've gone deeper into the smaller amount of dopamine that has just been released in addicts.
Let's watch the video that we prepared. It will show a cartoon of a brain and then focusing in on a particular part of the brain which has neurons that make the chemical transmitter dopamine. While we're waiting for the video, I could just give you some background. The human brain has about 100 billion nerve cells, so that's a big number. Each nerve cell communicates with thousands of other nerve cells at points of contact called synapses. That means a single human brain has about 100 trillion synapses. For what it's worth, that's a bigger number, 100 trillion, than the total number of stars that Einstein estimated was in the entire universe. So in a single human brain. So now we're focusing in on the center part of the brain where there are chemical transmitters released from the end of one nerve cell. Those little yellow spheres would be one transmitter. That's another transmitter. This is supposed to be a dopamine nerve cell. And in the course of chronic drug administration, what we and other groups have seen that certain drugs of abuse actually causes a shrinkage of these VTA dopamine nerve cells. So a physical loss in the robustness of these cells and a loss of dopamine release, and that coincides with what Nora and colleagues have shown, that there's fewer receptors that recognize the dopamine. So in an addict's brain, there's an impaired dopamine nerve cell and an impaired ability to detect the dopamine, leading to a dramatic reduction in the ability to experience reward. So throughout life, we walk around, we eat a good meal, someone tells us they love us, we see a friend, have sex, whatever a reward might be. That releases dopamine and keeps us going. An addict does not have, in the extreme, does not have those same experiences because their dopamine pathway is impaired. So natural reward is impaired.
And because they're feeling short-circuited,
exactly.
They go out and abuse something to try and get that reward?
The easiest way to feel normal again is by taking the drug.
So by taking the drug, does it elevate more release of dopamine? Does it bring them back up to where?
Probably never back to where they would be with a person who has a normally functioning dopamine system getting a strong natural reward.
And do you have other animation too, or is that the only one you have?
I have one more, but I don't need to show it now.
No, let's show it.
Okay, let's show one more. This one relates to, these videos look like space aliens or something. This is supposed to be a branch of a nerve cell that those mushrooms are really what are called spines that are protruding from the dendrite, what's called a dendrite, to receive incoming information. Let's run the video one more time, please. And what happens, and I think that this type of growth of these spines, growth of new synapses, is what's mediating. Now you'll watch and you'll see drug exposure gradually, progressively over time, leading to an increase in these detectors of synaptic transmission. This is probably among the mechanisms that are mediating these lifelong memories.
I'm sorry, you lost me there.
Sorry about that.
So the beginning...
Doesn't everybody have a PhD in neuroscience?
I left mine at home. The beginning was a normal person's brain, and then after chronic drug addiction, you grow more of these things.
Connections, yes.
And how does more of those connections, why is that a bad thing?
It probably depends on where in the brain this is occurring, but in the part of the brain that we're talking about, these increased connections represent very powerful memories that would, for example, draw a connection between feeling stressed, taking drug as a way to relieve the stress.
Got it.
And that's the way we are beginning to understand how the brain mediates those phenomena.
Did you want to add something?
No, I really like this finding because that actually relates to some of my findings later on.
Oh,
so
no, he really liked your cool video. Yeah. Well, let's talk about genetics, because you mentioned that a moment ago, and I'm curious. First of all, one quick question. Can you look at a brain of somebody and tell if they're going to become an addict? In other words...
Not right now.
Not right now.
That would be a great goal.
So is there a genetic... We keep hearing that there's a genetic link for addiction, but, I mean, that would mean you are born an addict. No. I'm curious. I'd like to hear all of you weigh in on that.
It's different from eye color or height, which you're born with brown eyes. You'll have brown eyes for life. The genetics that underlie common chronic disease, whether it's psychiatric disease or diabetes and asthma, is much more complex. And what we're talking about are genes that confer a risk for an illness, not a deterministic surety that they will get that illness. So for example, the genetic risk for addictions is about 50%. That's really heritable. That's more heritable than high cholesterol, high blood pressure.
What do you mean by 50%?
Half of the risk for addiction is genetic.
Really?
Yes.
And what is it? What is it for cancer or for?
For many
heart
cancers,
disease?
it's even less than 50%.
Huh.
So addiction is actually pretty genetic. The challenge is that unlike something, for example, Huntington disease, which is caused by an abnormality in a single gene, and if you have that abnormal copy of the gene, you will get Huntington's disease with 100% assurance. That's not the case in addiction, because only half of the risk is genetic, and the rest depends on all sorts of other things.
And we can't, at this point, look at that gene. I mean, it's not like the breast cancer. I mean,
we haven't. It's been very hard to find them. I mean, this is one of the major focuses of NIDA.
Well, you know, one of the things in terms of what Eric was saying, we are coming to realize that it's not like with Huntington, where you identify a gene and you know you're going to develop the disease. But what we're understanding is that these genes are influencing the way that the brain develops and ultimately functions. So the risk that they are imposing has to do with the fact that your brain will be responding to an environmental insult in a different way. One of the most investigated is, for example, a gene that that modifies the way that the amygdala, which is a limbic area, responds to stress. So if you have this gene that is a high-risk gene, it will make you much more vulnerable to depression, but only if you are in a stressful environment. The same thing, for example, since now it's so much in the news, the association between certain people taking marijuana and then developing schizophrenia. What now is coming to realize is that if you have a certain gene which has a risk allele that makes you more vulnerable to schizophrenia, if you smoke marijuana, then can accelerate the process. So we're understanding genes as influencing the risk, and this is not just for drug addiction, for all of the mental diseases, for basically most of them, but even for many of the medical diseases, such as diabetes or obesity. You may have a gene that creates a vulnerability, but if you don't expose to the environmental insult, it will never happen, which is, from the policy perspective and from the healthcare perspective, very important, because it doesn't mean you are predestined to develop that disease, but you can actually do interventions that can help that individual, that can protect that person from the development of these conditions.
So when you hear people in recovery say, I was born an addict, you don't think that's possible? I mean, other things in life have to conspire. I mean, this is a lot of what you do.
Right. I think they were born with their propensity, and then things happened that actually drove them to become an addict. But certainly, if there's a family history, there's a much, much greater risk.
Or perhaps born with, we don't have that slide up anymore, a brain that doesn't as efficiently, whatever it is, exchange dopamine. Experience dopamine.
Or perhaps even a tendency to really try to do things in the most, to go all the way as much as they can. So it can be good if you're in a certain job, but it may not be good if you're a child and you're taking one candy and then you can't stop and you want another and another and another. So it's just a propensity, and it depends on what you're going to do with it.
And what about, I was so interested to hear in this video, this was Seth Mnookin talking about always feeling anxious as a child. So many addicts will tell you, of that feeling, always a feeling different, other, not fitting in. But also you're hearing more and more lately about this anxiety component.
Right. I think that there's a lot of what we call comorbidity with drug addiction. So people who suffer from addiction, oftentimes, a lot of the time, also suffer from other psychiatric disorders. And oftentimes, as I'm going to talk about the importance of adolescence, it starts early on, and anxiety is it's one of the most common disorders in adolescents and in children. And if they can find something that will help them, then they will use it.
Sure, if you spent your entire childhood fighting panic attacks every day or every week, and all of a sudden somebody says, have a glass of wine or have a beer, and you feel a lot more comfortable in the world, you could understand why somebody might begin to abuse that. Yeah. All right. Let's talk also, there's one other term that you brought out, the gene expression. Did you talk about that already?
I don't think so, but I could talk about it now, or why don't we move on? Maybe you want to
No, go ahead and talk about it now. Right now.
A lot of these changes that we're talking about are mediated through changes in gene expression. And it's a hard concept to explain. What you're seeing here is the DNA double helix. We know that the DNA double helix encodes messenger RNAs, which is that purple line pointing up to the top of the screen. And the messenger RNAs then encode proteins, and it's the proteins in the cell that mediate most of functions. And change in gene expression is an important way in which cells change in a very stable way. And the best analogy I like to use is when you go to the gym to exercise, the reason you get stronger is because every muscle cell in a muscle bundle, upon use, that cell makes more muscle proteins because the gene expression of those cells, of those genes, is increased to make more messenger RNA, more protein. The muscle cell gets bigger, the entire muscle gets bigger and stronger. And in the same way, those changes occur in nerve cells in the brain, and that's how we learn. And we think that drugs of abuse represent a maladaptive type of learning where through changes in gene expression, very long-lasting maladaptations occur, like a shrinkage of dopamine cells, like a growth of new synapses that mediate some of the pathologies associated with addiction. I think Amir is going to talk more about that.
Well, thank you for introducing Amir. Because, I actually already did, but we've already seen a lot about how adult brains and addiction, but you've got some amazing statistics actually on gateway drugs.
Right, so part of my work was to look at the effect of nicotine on cocaine because I think more and more now people see addiction as a developmental disorder. We think about addiction as something that just happens to adults, but in truth is, it really has its roots stemmed in adolescence. That's when most of the people who become addicted try drugs.
What percentage of addicts get addicted in adolescence?
So I think, for example, 90% of people who will become smokers start smoking before they're 18. And only 10% will become smoker if they start to smoke after the age of 18. So that's like it's a massive difference. But it's not only for cigarettes or nicotine, it's also true for other illicit drugs. And for example, if you start using an illicit drug before you're 18, we have a 25% chance of becoming addicted. But if you start using an illicit drug after the age of 21, you only have a 4% chance of becoming addicted. So adolescence is a crucial time for the development of addiction. And I started to become very interested in that because I looked at the effect of nicotine on cocaine, and I found that actually nicotine has a very unique ability to basically loosen the DNA. And Eric was talking about gene expression, and when that DNA is loosened, what happens is that when cocaine comes along, then genes that are related to addiction, and this work is very much relies on Eric Nestler's work, then there's a much more massive increase of gene expression that's related to addiction.
Wait, so you're saying that, if I get this right, 97% of cocaine users smoke first?
Right, so that's another finding. It's like basically people go through a certain sequence. And I remember I had one of my patients, one of my first patients in residency, and he described to me, when I saw him, he had cocaine-induced psychosis. I remember how he walked into the ER as if it were yesterday. He was very guarded. He wouldn't speak. He was 25 years old, and he was completely, like, he basically blurted something about wanting to kill himself before others get to him. And we admitted him to the floor. And I remember at that time I didn't have an appreciation to that part of his history because he said that he started smoking when he was 12. He came from a very affluent family in Greenwich, Connecticut, and his parents divorced, and he didn't have a lot of supervision. He started smoking at 12 and drinking. By the time he was 15, he started smoking marijuana, and by the time he was 16 and a half, he started using cocaine. And then that's when his life went from really bad to horrible and worse, and he was a castaway teen, and then he dealt with a lot of other really horrible consequences. But I didn't pay attention at the time to the fact that he followed a very specific sequence of events. Mm-hmm. He started smoking and drinking, and then he went on to marijuana, and then he went on to cocaine. And in my research, I started looking at the effect of nicotine specifically on cocaine. And I found that nicotine has this effect that it increases gene expression that's related to addiction. One of the genes is the FOSB gene.
Is it just for cocaine?
So we haven't looked at other drugs, but the mechanism, the fact that it opens up the DNA, that it loosens the DNA and enables expression more, suggests that it could possibly do it also for other drugs.
I mean, otherwise, it's sort of scientifically strange to think that, nicotine would only make you more susceptible to be a cocaine addict, not a meth addict.
So actually, we looked at methamphetamine, and it also has the same effect with methamphetamine.
With methamphetamine?
Yes.
What about heroin?
So we haven't looked at that yet.
But maybe, how do you know it's causal? Maybe, an addict's an addict.
Right, so now other people are looking at alcohol and to see whether that also has whether it works through the same system of loosening up the DNA that increases the expression of the effect of other drugs later on. But what I found actually later in adolescence was something very different. I didn't expect that. I thought that nicotine would do that even more so in adolescence. But I found something very different, because when I looked at the adolescent brain at baseline, I saw that the DNA was already loosened up in that particular area in the brain, in the nucleus accumbens. So at baseline, the adolescent brain is much more sensitive to the effect of almost any other drug of abuse. And so if you expose the adolescent brain to any of those drugs, you'll get more of that growth that Eric described, because the DNA is more open, basically open to soaking up new experiences. Mm-hmm. And to
so more
growth.
Of that brain change that you were just talking about happens in adolescents' brains who abuse drugs and alcohol?
There's a good reason to believe that, because that DNA is more loose and that you would get more expression and more growth and a stronger propensity to addiction. And that would agree with the fact that, so why are 25% of people more likely to get addicted to a drug if you're exposed? I think we're going to see a video of that DNA. So this is the compact DNA. That you see that oftentimes in adults. And what I saw in adolescence was a very different picture. It was something more like that, a much looser DNA. Mm-hmm. So the gene expression, so the genes that are over there basically can get expressed a lot more in that particular stance when it's more loose. The DNA is more, it's
and
less
at what
compact.
age do they revert to the adult sort of picture?
So the work that I do is basically basic science work is in animal models, in mice. And in mice, I see that this change reverts back. I guess the human equivalent will be around 25, something like that.
And yet a younger brain is more resilient, as you said, and more able to recover. So it's a bit of a dual-edged sword, right?
But the plasticity can go both ways,
right.
Adaptive and maladaptive.
Okay.
So he can learn much more, he has this capacity to learn in an amazing way, the adolescent brain, but it also has the capacity to change, and it's more plastic.
And of course, when you talk about an adolescent experimenting with drugs or alcohol, you're talking about, I don't know how many teenagers I've interviewed, and it can't ever happen to me. Nothing bad will ever happen to me. I mean, this sort of not inferiority complex, the exact opposite of that, actually. I'm not vulnerable, this invulnerability.
Right. So I like to call that the daredevil brain.
Right.
The adolescent brain is the daredevil brain. And so because I'm a child psychiatrist, and I think that age, the adolescence, is the key to study and understand a lot of the molecular processes that happen in the brain. So I started, after I saw this finding that the adolescent brain is just so different than the adult brain, I started looking at other molecules. And part of what I'm finding now is some of the molecules that are responsible for encoding fear in adults are expressed a lot less in the adolescent brain. So even the very machinery that encodes fear is expressed less in the adolescent brain. So you can try to scare them until the cows come home, but the very machinery that exists to actually encode that fear is expressed in a much, much lower grade.
No, we see them all the time, even in, not talking about substance abuse, but engaging in such teenage risky behavior.
So you're going to say, oh, if you do that, it's going to be horrible, something bad's going to happen, and they were here, oh, risk, I want to take that risk, I want to try it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, like I've got a son about to enter adolescence, and I'm dreading it because he's got that kind of, I can do it, of course,
But
and
I think it really is important to understand that this adolescent time is so crucial for the development of this disease, because then it has implications in terms of prevention, in terms of intervention, in terms of what we can do. And that's why I think it's important to understand it's a really crucial time, and especially if their brains are more plastic, and especially if intervention can actually help them recover more.
And just one last question before we move on to Dr. Janda. If you intervene and get the adolescent help while they're still an adolescent, in other words, is there a better chance of success because the brain is so plastic, or there's better plasticity, as you put it, and they haven't sort of settled in and formed and set into adulthood brain?
Well, I think what happens is that, especially addiction, as we talk, it's a chronic disease, and it takes time to evolve. And so if you catch it earlier on, before it gets to the end stage of it, then you have a much better chance of actually preventing it from getting to the end stage. Because sometimes I have, some of the patients that I see, when you see them at the end stage, I think a lot of people don't, unless you have a personal experience of it, of someone that you know, they don't really realize how horrible it can be. I mean, I have one patient, and now she's an alcoholic, and now, thank God, she's been sober for many years, but at the very end stage of her disease, she used to drink alcohol. She had horrible gastritis because of the alcohol. She would buy bottles of vodka, and then she would throw it up, but she would want the effect of the alcohol. So she would collect it and drink it again to get the effect. So it's not just something that, oh, I don't have self-will anymore. It's not about self-will anymore. It's a very different disease, but that's at the end stage. And it doesn't start like that.
How long had she been drinking when she was at that stage?
She's been drinking since she was a teenager, and she was in her 30s.
In her 30s.
It doesn't start like that, and I think some of the findings are that even if you do one intake session in research, you call a subject in and you talk to them about their drinking history, that is enough in itself to actually change their drinking history, to change their drinking behavior for a few weeks later on. They drink less. Yes, just having to sort of go over what have you been drinking over the past year or so. So that's enough to actually even institute a change.
Well, I guess because that would force you to, I think a lot of addicts avert their eyes, tomorrow I'll wipe the slate clean and get up and run 10 miles and bake a cake and, go be fantastic at my job and whatever. But I think if you have to just sit and tell somebody what you drank or what you did, it makes you fully accountable for your own behavior. And you're less able to avert your eyes from it.
I think when that patient recites one of the sayings in AA is that denial is not a river in Egypt.
That's one of countless sayings in AA, yes. I also hear that other places though too. I think it's just denial. Anyway, did you want to add something?
No, because I do want to reiterate on the notion as we're addressing the problem of substance use, the most important thing that we can do is prevention. And for prevention strategies to be effective, we have to target children and adolescents. And Eric was saying, yes, it would be fantastic if we had a gene or a brain that could tell us who's going to become addicted. And yet we know who are the most vulnerable. Any kid that has a mental illness is at a much higher risk of use of substance than any others. So one of the strategies that is very, very relevant is to be able to identify when you have a kid that's taking drugs, to rule out whether there's an underlying mental illness that's driving the use of drugs. Because again, one of the myths that a lot of people have is people take drugs in order to feel high and have a good time. But a lot of people take drugs in order to feel better. And so you have an indicator. If you already have a teenager consuming high doses of drugs, you want to be able to rule out the possibility that there is a mental illness. Because if you properly treat it, then you prevent the escalation further.
You meaning you're talking about depression?
Depression, anxiety which is attention
huge.
Deficit hyperactivity disorder, difficulties with extroversion. All of these put a higher risk for the kid to take drugs because they may basically want to feel better, and so they may take drugs in order to do that, or to just feel better. If you're very anxious and you drink alcohol, that calms you down. If you take marijuana, that calms you down. If you have ADHD and you cannot sustain attention, you take cocaine, that will temporarily help you. So this is something that right now we can do, and I think, again, emphasizes the importance of doing prevention measures, because clearly all of the data has shown that substance abuse can be prevented. We've been very good with tobacco. Not perfect, but we've brought it down by 50% in teenagers in less than 10 years. So prevention strategies work.
And to bring screening and prevention into primary care.
Absolutely.
Screening for?
When you go to a doctor, doctors should ask how much alcohol you're drinking, are you smoking?
Actually that 2% of a doctor's education deals with substance abuse. I mean, it's amazing how many doctors don't ask.
Yep.
They're not trained. They're not trained to recognize it. So as a medical student, you never really are taught how substance abusers come. You feel embarrassed because it's highly stigmatized. How am I going to ask this old lady whether she's drinking more? I mean, there is that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it is unfortunate, but it is the truth. So you rather not ask. And then if you ask and they tell you, yes, I'm drinking half a bottle of whiskey a day, do you really want to know? What are you going to do?
Well, and I actually had a doctor tell me once in an interview that whenever he would ask a patient how much he or she was drinking every day, double it.
You double or triple.
Yeah, like nobody ever tells the truth. It's like, oh no, I only had 1 glass of wine. You know, but the glass was like a big gulp cup, you know. So,
but I also think that with adolescence, it's even more of a problem because adolescents, you're programmed not to tell your parents everything. No adolescent tells their parents everything.
No, but
it's
so important. I'm working on an hour on children and anxiety, and that's a very interesting thing to think of it that way. That if we were more aware of the fact that anxious kids. Kids who are depressed or have ADHD would be kids who would be much more susceptible to turning to something altering to make them feel better. I think it would be a big step forward towards prevention. Another big step toward prevention obviously would be a vaccine. And we've seen sometimes in vivid, frightening detail how addiction can alter the brain in so many ways. Dr. Kim Janda and his team have developed a vaccine to block the effect of heroin. Tell us about this, Dr. Janda.
Well, we've been developing a number of vaccines. I originally started developing a cocaine vaccine back in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. And then we moved into nicotine. We've done methamphetamine, but heroin over the last 5 years, we've been working hard on. I was mainly interested in developing a heroin vaccine actually for third world countries.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, actually, if you look, there's been an increase in HIV with heroin abuse because sharing of needles. And so in places like in Africa, places like Russia, they don't have exchangeable needles. Even China, it's frowned upon. They don't have methadone clinics. And so vaccines do we have that slide? Can you show the history? Yeah, vaccines have kind of taken a back seat. And they've been known for Chinese employing variolation since the year 1000. It's kind of amazing because what they used was dry pustules, and they would snort it.
Oh.
But think about that. Actually, vaccines nowadays, flu vaccines are actually inhaled. They're intranasal.
Right.
So this was known back in thousands of years ago. People have used this. Vaccines are very inexpensive. I would easily argue that the 2 greatest advances over the last 75 years have been antibiotics and vaccines, polio.
So how do these vaccines work? I mean, how does a heroin vaccine work?
How does a heroin vaccine work? So, considering, as my colleagues have talked about, the reason why we started to develop vaccines is because you've seen the complexity of the brain. And trying to develop specific agonists or antagonists for these receptors. And there's not just a single receptor that's controlling addiction for, let's say, cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin. The other thing I want to bring up is heroin is not the drug. Heroin's a prodrug. The real drug is what's called 6-acetyl-morphine, which then morphs into morphine. Morphine is then the actual drug. And the reason why heroin is made is because it crosses the blood-brain barrier very quickly. Heroin has a very short half-life in the body. It's like 20, 30 seconds. And so in creating these vaccines, we have to look at how the drug interacts with the body and how the body interacts with the drug. So it's a little bit different than developing a vaccine, let's say, against influenza or HIV. The immune system is programmed basically to remove foreign invaders. Our immune system was not developed to say cocaine is foreign or heroin is foreign. Maybe 10,000 years from now, our immune system will be more highly developed and say, well, yeah, maybe those are foreign substances. So it doesn't recognize that. So what we did over the years is try to develop ways to stimulate our immune system to recognize drugs of abuse as being foreign.
And this is just for drugs, or could this also be applied to alcohol?
I've developed a vaccine for obesity too. If you want to get into it, we can talk about that later. I know people are more interested in that, but well, I shouldn't say more interested, but it's another aspect. But
vaccines, you know, the way we use the word vaccine is you take it before so you don't get the problem. I mean, I don't understand.
Well,
you take this vaccine.
That's true in one sense, but vaccines are being developed now for like staph or other bacterial diseases where you may have the problem. You could take the vaccine to clear the infection. So that's not completely true that it's not preventive. It's also going to be therapeutic. So the vaccines aren't a typical vaccine like you'd say for polio. You get a shot, maybe wouldn't have to have another one for many years. The vaccines have to be given over a period of several weeks, and then you build up an immunity to the drug, and then it'll last for a period of time. And just like if you were a foreign invader of bacteria, it takes a little bit of time to clear the infection. Our own immune system can do that, and it'll wane off. The same thing with the drugs. It'll wane off, and then you have to be reboosted, and it'll kick back up again.
But so what it does is remove the effect of the drug?
No, what it does is, do we have that one picture showing the brain? Oh, right there. So you see the little red dotted lines at the neck. The immune system typically doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It's not privileged to do that. So what the vaccine does is it blocks the drug from crossing the blood-brain barrier. In some cases, depending on the drug, just like I said, how the drug reacts with the body reacts with the drug, you can create a vacuum and it can pull the drug out of the brain, depending on how strongly these antibodies bind to the drug.
So if somebody had taken the vaccine and then decided they still wanted to go do heroin, what would happen to that person?
What would happen if the vaccine worked well, they wouldn't get the potential psychoactive effects for the drug.
But wouldn't you still have the potential life-threatening effects of the drug?
Life-threatening, you mean of overdose?
Right.
Actually, with the heroin vaccine, we haven't published this data, but we've in rodent models, we've gone as high as 35 to 40 mg per kg of heroin, and typically 4 mg will kill an animal. And they're perfectly fine. They're happy as little clams running around. So they have no effect. So this is actually, it's kind of interesting because with this vaccine that we've developed here, it could be used as an overdose therapy too at the same time.
Right, here in New York City, actually right now, the police officers, I think just last week, are now equipped with these shots for heroin overdoses. I'm asking only because it raises the concern that if somebody's on the vaccine and they think, I want to get high, and doggone it, this didn't do enough. I'm going to keep doing more and more and more and try and override my vaccine and kill themselves in the process.
Yeah, so as we've heard, the vaccine is to be used when people have lapses. So it will prevent a relapse. That's where we see the importance of it. Like you heard, maybe you hear a particular song or a particular place, a particular smell, and you take the drug, a taste of the drug. And then what happens is you're going to relapse maybe. But the vaccine, if in place, would prevent that. I mean, there are potential caveats where one could say, well, you could take more and more of the drug to surmount it, and that's a possibility because the vaccines are like little sponges. They can only take up so much, and you have to wring those guys out. So depending on the drug, they're all different. So not one vaccine is the same for all drugs. It's different. But with regards to heroin, it's very special because, as I said, heroin morphs itself into multiple different drugs before it gets into the brain. And so you don't have many of the issues like you have with cocaine or methamphetamine that last very long periods of time. If you can stop it from getting across the blood-brain barrier, you can kind of win the battle because once it's over there, it doesn't come out easily. Morphine doesn't cross readily. It doesn't go across easily either. So there's some advantages with some of these vaccines that depending on the drug, they could have for like overdose, whereas in certain ones they can't.
I did a story on mothers in rehab, and most of them were there for alcohol abuse, but there was one woman who was there for heroin addiction, and she said that heroin was the most addictive drug. Is that true?
I'm not a clinician, but I know when we put these animals on long-term access for heroin, they just look terrible from the other drugs we've used, like cocaine. Methamphetamine's really quite bad too, but heroin, they just look awful.
We think that heroin and stimulants would be cocaine and methamphetamine, amphetamine, are probably the most addictive.
But it's a really hard question. What makes something more addictive versus less addictive?
It's a hard question to answer because we would have to do a study and it would be impossible to do it. Go to a large state university campus, 40,000 kids, treat 1,000 of them with heroin, 1,000 of them with amphetamine, 1,000 of them with marijuana, and then stop it suddenly and see how many are hooked. That's a good study to fund.
But
so you can't do the study, but you can't answer the question without a study like that. So we're left really not knowing how intrinsically addictive each of these substances is.
But there is some indirect data that gives you an incline in terms of how addictive drugs are. For example, the epidemiologists who like to measure everything that they can get their hands on actually assess the number of people, the percentage of people that when they get exposed to a drug will become addicted to them, and then they rank them. And interestingly, the drug that comes on top is actually nicotine, but that has a caveat because nicotine is legal. So it's a widespread availability increases the likelihood that you will be repeatedly administering it. But if you take just the illegal drugs, heroin actually has the highest percentage. Something like 25 to 30% of people that get exposed to heroin will become addicted. And then if you take those numbers, you have methamphetamine is also highly addictive. And then marijuana is probably has the lowest rate, and it's only 9% of people that get exposed will become addicted. But also that depends at what age. So if you are less than 18, 60% of them will become addicted to marijuana. So that gives us a sense in population basis, how do they fare one versus the other, considering just illicit substances. Then we have another way clinically to try to determine, which is when you start to take the drug regularly, how much time does it take you to escalate until lose control? And in that one, methamphetamine is probably one of the fastest drugs. Within less than 1 year, you can get people very, very severely addicted. But opiates also create this very fast escalation. And finally, the animal models. So what we assign the addictiveness of drugs to their ability, to their potency to increase dopamine in the brain. And of all of the drugs, the most potent drug that we currently know in terms of its ability to increase dopamine is methamphetamine. So you take all of this information and you come exactly to the conclusion of what Eric was saying, that probably the most addictive drugs that we have, independent of the legality or not legality, have to do with methamphetamine and heroin.
That's what I'd...
And cocaine also is a high, but there it goes.
And getting back to the
other point too is well, how some of these drugs are being taken. So, you know, in the 70s, they were going to try to legalize cocaine. If you go back to the Carter and looking at that, and it wasn't until I think it was '84 which crack hit the scene. And crack is, Nora will tell you, is extremely addictive. And people have this misconception what crack is. Crack is cocaine. You take cocaine, you heat it up, sodium bicarb, let it crystallize out, you get these large crystals, it's smoked. And the thing about that is smoking it gets to the brain much quicker than snorting it or injecting it. And so like that, or with methamphetamine, these people go on these runs for several days taking it. And so again, depending on the drug, can impact how you're seeing the addiction take place. The other thing is interesting is kind of cost, supply and demand. So with heroin, when we see more drug enforcement in terms of bringing it into the country, we also see an increase of what's called synthetic opioids. So things like fentanyl, which was made in the 60s, it's about 100 to 500 times more potent than morphine. It's actually probably not more potent. It just crosses the blood-brain barrier easier. It's very easy to make, so there's, you know, we've all seen Breaking Bad. There's these rogue chemists out there who are making this. You've heard of things like China White. So what happens when the heroin demand, you know, so heroin's not pure, it's cut up with different things, and you can use very small amounts of these synthetic opioids to give the addict the so-called need. And so that's another thing that I think we have to contend with is that these other things are being mixed in. So you could say, well, he overdosed on heroin. That may not be potentially true. He could have overdosed on one of these synthetic opioids also involved.
Getting back to your vaccines, have they been tested on humans?
They have. Cocaine and nicotine are in clinical trials.
And when might these things hit the market?
Well, when the FDA feels they're good enough to be approved. Some of them are still they're still lacking in terms of getting the immune response strong enough. There's a lot of variability, as you might, obviously diversity in our population, and so the vaccines can work well in some people and don't work so well in others. So those are some things that we need to look at a little more closely. And the other big thing is you're saying how quickly we can move these things forward. I don't know any drug company that's working on any of these vaccines except for one company that's working on nicotine. They will not work on any of these, on heroin. I have tried to go to every major company, biotech companies, Wall Street people saying, hey, would you be interested in funding a heroin vaccine moving forward that we could develop? And it's really, they're saying, wow, this is really interesting. You know, I knew someone that overdosed on this. It's great work you're doing, fantastic, but we just don't see a market for it.
Really?
Yeah. It's how much they think they're going to get back.
But there clearly is a market
for
it, and drug companies want profits. I mean, why wouldn't they want to market something that they could readily sell?
You know what? Maybe you know, I don't know a lot of HMOs that cover, you know, crack addicts or heroin addicts. So nicotine, smoking, one thing, but they're not. You know, in terms of what they're going to get back, if they're going to try to go forward and make this, Nora can comment more. But to develop a vaccine, the vaccine itself is extremely inexpensive. That's why I thought for third world countries for heroin. Once you have the vaccine made, it's inexpensive. But to move these through clinical trials costs probably $40, $50 million at the end of the day. And so for them to put that investment in that and what they're going to get back in return is what drives these things, I think. And so, yeah, the value's there.
And you know, you asked me at the beginning about policy issue, and this is one of the most sensitive ones because the science in the whole field of substance abuse is advanced to the point that we could have much better intervention, not just based on immunotherapies, vaccines, and monoclonal antibodies, but actually on medications. But we have this huge gap because the pharmaceutical industry does not feel that there is a profit to be made on the development of these type of medications. Now, this was reviewed many years ago, more than 15 years ago, by the Institute of Medicine that came back and said there should be an incentivization of the pharmaceuticals to go after that, just like we've done in vaccines in this country. If you don't incentivize, the companies are not going to develop vaccines for many of the diseases of childhood. Mm-hmm. My perspective is you are not going to be making money with tanks, but if there is a war, you need to develop tanks, and you then create an incentive because this is...
That was mood lighting, everybody.
Pharmaceutical company is listening.
Yes, no.
So the bottom line is that this is an issue where if we were to create incentives that actually would cost no money to the government, you just, for example, increase the patent that they could get, and the IOM had a whole list of incentives that could be made to accelerate the process. What Kim is saying is actually very, very relevant with respect to the heroin vaccine, because the injection of heroin is the #1 driver of the HIV epidemic in many countries in the world. Mm. And yet, this could be completely averted if there was a treatment intervention such as a vaccine for heroin. And so what is very exasperating is that you have the know-how, you have the knowledge, you know the road, but there is not the resources to move forward in that road. And yet you know that the cost of not moving forward in that road are just gigantic. So that's a little bit of the issues that we play with policy on a field that is stigmatized. So it's stigmatized in the healthcare system, and it's not considered one that is worthwhile of investment by private industry.
Why is it stigmatized in the healthcare system? I understand, you know, definitely when you talk to addicts or addicts' families, co-workers, you understand the stigma, but why in the healthcare? I mean, I'm not saying I agree with it. I think it's a terrible thing.
People who are drug addicts are difficult patients. They're difficult for the system, they're difficult for doctors and nurses, just as they're difficult for their family members. It's part of the disease.
And also the other thing too, they are not easy patients because they are in themselves in a lot of turmoil, but also because there is the belief that they are to blame for the consequences of their disease, and that is where a lot of the stigma. Well, that's because society is telling them that. Yeah, but that's the healthcare system says it's a lifestyle choice, and when I came to NIDA, I was asking, well, how can an insurance deny the treatment for a substance abusers, whether it's nicotine or it's alcohol? And the justification were to one of them, there are no treatments that work, and the other one, this is a lifestyle choice. Well, a lot of the diseases that we develop in chronic, many of them are related to behaviors that we are doing, and yet we never question it. So we treat addiction in a different way, because we have the sense that the person is choosing to take these drugs, is doing them on themselves. And then coupled to the fact that these individuals have a lot of emotional disruption, and because of the way that drugs affect their brain, they tend to lie, they need the drug, and they will do anything that they can in order to get the drug when they are actually addicted.
Well, you have perfectly teed up our second Seth Mnookin video, because he talks about willpower, the issue of willpower. Because so much, you're right, so much of the country, the prevailing attitude, and even people who think, oh no, it's a disease, will actually then go ahead and treat an addict like, you know what, get your you-know-what together.
I actually have a really good example of that same patient that I described before. Once described to me how, while she was at work, she was reading, everyone at work, the people were reading the New York Post, and they were reading about this woman that was arrested at the supermarket while she was trying to shop for food with her kids, and she was arrested because she was snorting heroin at the same time. Oh. And so most people's reaction were, oh my God, what a horrible mother. But her reaction, my patient, was, oh my God, I can't believe she was actually able to go through with it and try to take care of her kids despite this horrible illness. Because when she was drinking, she didn't want anyone around her. Her kids were with their father, and she couldn't take care of her kids. So I think we all have this idea, yeah, it's an illness, but then when we see something like that, it's hard for us to really relate, but it is an illness. And that woman was trying to take care of her kids while having a really difficult illness, trying to battle a really difficult illness.
I want to make a comment, just because a lot of public here, is that, you're asking why haven't some of these things moved forward quicker? And part of it is the politicians and the money coming in. The only person that's funding my research is NIDA right here. That's it. And the money that's coming into the NIH has been stagnant for many years. It's been the most difficult times that I've ever seen in terms of trying to get money to do research in these areas. I used to have a lot of hair, and I don't have any hair. I'm going to start doing research on that next. So I think the part of it is what the politicians feel the addict, it's a moral failure of the individual versus a disease, right? Until they can get around that it's not a moral failure, they're not going to put more money into that. If they don't put more money into it, we can't, move forward with some of this stuff. So I know we're trying to cut taxes and all these other things, but, if the NIH, if we don't get more infusing money into this, our whole system of academics in terms of doing research and the things I'm trying to do is going to collapse.
Well said. Let's take a look at this video that Seth made on willpower, and then I'd like to discuss this with all of you, that and the stigmatizing of the disease of addiction.
I've had some neuropsychological testing since I've been sober, partially to find out how my brain works. And the thing that really struck me is how valuable that information would have been, not to me probably, but to my parents and to doctors who were treating me when I was 15. And that is something that I find very exciting.
This, obviously, that he makes a compelling case for what you just made, which is that we need to study this. But, getting back to that story you told about your patient, the alcoholic, who was so desperate, I mean, that is such a vivid example of the fact that this isn't a matter of willpower. But how much do you bump up against that, all of you, in your work? I know that in the reporting that I've done on this issue, and my experience in this issue, it's a huge thing. I mean, people, it's a little bit like talking out of both sides of your mouth. We can all say all the right platitudes sometimes about how we look at the disease of addiction in this country. But the fact of the matter is we don't look at them the same way we look at a cancer patient, or even somebody with diabetes. It's not seen that way. It's seen as something you can control.
One of the troubling aspects of addiction is that we think that drugs of abuse actually damage the parts of the brain that mediate willpower and free will. And the ability to make an informed choice requires the brain functioning correctly, and it's the drugs that damage the brain's ability to do that.
Irreparably?
I don't think irreparably, but for a long time, and it's hard to get over it.
It's in a way, I like the metaphor of actually, because I think it describes it very, very nicely. You're driving in your car, and you see a cat crossing, and you want to brake. You don't want to hurt the cat. But if your brakes are not working, no matter how much you want to stop, you're not going to be able to stop, and you're going to hurt someone. So the reality, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so very difficult for people to understand, even if they theoretically say it's a disease of the brain, because we're all used to basically have control of our urges. We all, once in a while, fail, right? I mean, we have to be honest too, but most of the time, we can control our urges. So and we also value very much that ability to make a decision and carry through. So it's very difficult to understand that process happens because certain structures in the brain are there that allow you to do that. And if those structures don't work, even if though you say, I'm not going to take the drug, you don't have the neurobiological substrate that will allow you to stop, just like you have no brakes.
And how quickly after you begin to abuse drugs or alcohol do you lose that capacity to break?
Well, one of the things that we were discussing at the beginning was the notion to the extent that the vulnerability for addiction. And for example, now we recognize that one of the factors that make you more vulnerable is if you are born already with a system, a frontal system that does not enable you to regulate your emotions and desires as well. So there's variability. We all have different sizes. Well, all of our brains work differently, and there are people that are born with stronger or weaker. So that, for example, could be a factor that makes you vulnerable. But the repeated use of drugs by themselves can weaken those areas of the brain. How long it takes, again, is very variable, depends on drugs, age of initiation, and all of these things that we have discussed. Can we recover? And as Eric said, again, that's what we do therapeutically. We're doing interventions to try to strengthen those systems. So in the past, we were much more negative. Now we're developing not just therapeutic interventions based on behavior, but a big area on science in neuroscience is the use of devices like electrical stimulation or magnetic stimulation to strengthen certain areas. So all of these.
We do that already?
We are doing it. There's research going on to, for example, use these stimulation devices for the treatment of depression. There's research using it for the treatment of drug addiction to improve executive function. And there are many evidence-based behavioral interventions that can help us strengthen executive function. So the more we know about the brain, the better we are in our ability to do tailored interventions to try to strengthen systems that may be weakened, in this case by drugs or by other circumstances.
And yet so much of the language that you hear in recovery is focused on, it seems almost to be like willpower, like you know, one day at a time in AA, and making those decisions not to take drugs or drink.
I mean, trying to rebuild those systems in the brain and regain control.
But that's why I keep asking, and I must have asked this 10 times tonight, well, how long does it take for the brain to recover?
It varies from person to person tremendously. And I think one important lesson is that people go through treatment, they fail, they should go through treatment again, and they may fail again. It doesn't undo the successes of the past treatments. And sometimes people need to go through treatments a dozen times before all of a sudden something clicks and they're able to maintain abstinence.
And that also contributes to the stigma associated to the disease, doesn't it?
The fact that it's not like you relapsing.
Exactly. And I think that, you know, the addict probably begins to feel, you know, anguish and powerless.
And their families.
And their families frustrated, impatient, get it together.
But there's also another aspect that I sort of mentioned before is that there's a much higher risk in adolescence, and that it doesn't start with cocaine. It usually starts with smoking and drinking, and that that's an age where we can intervene a lot more. We actually have, well, you seem to think that you have a little bit of power over your kids, or that you can, even other interventions that I know that people don't like because it seems like an invasion of privacy, but
like what?
But like drug testing, for example. So we really try to shy away from it, but it is a tool. We would love it in psychiatry if we would have tools, diagnostic tools. We hardly have any diagnostic tools. It's not like in other areas of medicine where we can take blood pressure or do an echocardiogram, but we do have the ability to do drug testing to know whether kids have been exposed or not exposed, especially if they're high risk, or you see that they've changed their behavior, because this idea that maybe they'll tell you what they're doing, I think is really, it's not very realistic if you understand what adolescence is about and how adolescents actually, like work in the world. But we have certain tools that we underutilize, I think. And if you ask most of the clinicians that I know, if you ask them about whether children, like adolescents, should be drug tested, certain adolescents that are at high risk, you get a resounding yes. But if you ask the public, it would seem like, no, that's an invasion of privacy. You should trust them. You should talk to them. People have this aversion to the idea, but you can really know what's going on with a teenager. It's very simple. It's a very simple test to do, and then you'll know what they're exposed to. And I've had patients, I have one patient that by the time she was 16 and a half, she probably did everything under the face of this planet. She did heroin. She did everything. And one time she was doing some mushrooms in school, and she had all these epiphanies, and she wrote it down in a journal, and she lost the journal. She was then summoned to the counselor's office with her mom, and she had a party that weekend, and she was like, they sent her home. She was crying and crying and crying on the car, came home, ran upstairs, uncontrollably sobbing into the pillow, and then the mother said, okay, she said, it's the first time I've ever tried anything. I've never done anything, sobbing into the pillow. And the mother said, okay, I believe you. It's fine. You can go to the party. And that patient, she was an adult when she told me the story. She said at that moment, she was like smiling into the pillow, saying, sucker, I got her. But that patient went on to go to college, and she was raped, and she suffered other consequences. And you can intervene in adolescence, but I don't think we're utilizing all the tools that we have.
Yeah, you mentioned in that story. I mean, we're obviously focusing tonight on the brain and the science of addiction, but the very real life consequences of addiction go, way beyond just the damage that you do to your body when you're taking that drug or too much alcohol, but placing yourself in positions where, I mean, there's a fantastic book by a young woman named Corinne Zelkis called Smashed, Story of a Drunken Girlhood. And she was a straight A student, phenomenal, like really smart girl who was drinking alcoholically from the time she was a sophomore in high school and kept it all hidden. As another friend of mine, Mary Carr, who's an amazing writer, she wrote a book called Lit about her journey as an alcoholic Harvard professor and mother of a son. And as she said about alcoholic women, pardon the language, oh, we are sneaky bitches. So, I mean, you're dealing with, a population that will, as you said, lie about what they're doing for a variety of reasons, but, mostly so that they can continue to do that. So it sounds like what we've reached is sort of an impasse, which is we have the stigma that's preventing more of the research and funding for more research. And at the same time, if we had more science that we would get from the research, we would have less stigma. It's like chicken, how do you break that impasse?
Well, I think you break the impasse with knowledge, because I remember when I was born in Mexico, and I was growing up in Mexico, and I remember clearly the woman, the neighbor across, and she developed cancer, and people were speaking like in a secret, and nobody dared to speak out of cancer. And I remember very clearly how stigmatized cancer was. Then that disappeared, and then I went into psychiatry, and mental illness are still stigmatized, but addiction continues to be so. And I think a lot of it is the lack of understanding. And we have the sense, because we don't really understand how the brain works, so we have the assumption that a lot of our behaviors and thoughts and the capacities that we give for granted are automatic, and we don't realize that they are not until we lose them. And so it's very difficult to conceptualize. And I think that one of the other aspects that has made it very hard for the healthcare system to bring it forward as another disease is that we have very few medications that we can use in the treatment of drug addiction. I think if we had vaccines, I think if we could have actually more potent and efficacious medications against drug addiction, it would be much more easy to accept and comprehend, and that will start to erase some of the stigma. So I'm optimistic that knowledge and technologies will change this.
And there has been progress.
Absolutely.
The knowledge base today compared to 20 years ago is really vast. We know a lot about the brain, a lot about addiction, and there have been some improved treatments, and there'll be more. And as the treatments come, then the stigma will be reduced.
But they are very, we do have treatments. I don't want to say we don't. We do, and they are very valuable. But the reality is that if you compare where we are in drug addiction treatment versus where we are on HIV, there's a huge gap. And yet HIV, which is a devastating disease, is a new disease. And we invested the resources.
There was this national mobilization
yes,
to fix that disease.
Yeah, we're not curing it, but people can live very healthy lives and die of something else. Even for nicotine, which kills how many people in the United States?
What's NIDA's estimate of the cost of drug abuse and alcoholism?
It's basically more than $500 billion a year.
Unbelievable. I mean, given that cost, just that, like we're not even talking about the human suffering involved, but just the financial cost alone you would think would be enough to drive a drug company to want to cash in on all those people wanting to alleviate that pain.
Yeah, but you have to look at we've been talking about the fluidity of the brain, the complexity of the brain. I think what people want is, just like if you had a bacterial infection. Take this. You'll be good in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay? And you have cocaine addiction. Oh, take this. You'll be cured in about a month. It's just not going to happen that way. And so I think because there's no concrete piece that someone can say, you can take this and it'll take care of you, it's difficult to fund something. You can't give me this endpoint, right, where people want. And so the goalposts keep changing. I don't think people who are investing in that bothers them. But I mean, the brain's complexity and the fluidity, it's going to, and you have to just recognize that.
We're now used to taking blood pressure medication, cholesterol medication every day for the rest of our lives. So it may be that a person who has an addiction, once a treatment becomes available, will do the same. But that's okay. We just need those.
I can't imagine
we need
an
those
addict
treatments.
who if you could tell any addict that I've ever met, if you take this pill once a day, every day for the rest of your life, this horrible thing will go away. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine who would say no to that. I mean,
zero time. I just said exactly.
Oh, we run out of time. Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and you've been a fascinating and wonderful audience tonight. We really appreciate you being here. Have a great night.